All right, everybody, it is 10:30, so I'm going to get started on time here. Yes, indeed. So I know how to silence my phone, but unfortunately I do not know how to disconnect it from my computer. So I can put my phone on airplane mode though, actually. Yeah, so you all are getting my live stream thought process on my phone here. Give me just a moment while I do that. Perfect. All right, so no more dings now. Okay, 10:31. We are getting started on time. My name is Cody. I am the owner of Santa Cruz Body Mechanics, and I am joining Liberty Rising today for a little nuts and bolts of functional movement workshop. And we are going to talk about, primarily focus on 7 functional movements. Those are not like, it's not an exhaustive list of kind of fundamental human movement, but these are 7 movements that kind of across modalities, movement modalities, that people kind of agree on are the base of some fundamental human movements, meaning that we use these things, we use these movements every day, all day. All humans use them kind of in some form or another, regardless of whether you are a seated mover or you are not, right? So whether we're ambulatory, bipedal, 2 feet, or whether we are non-bipedal, ambulatory, seated movers, we'll use some sort of these 7 movements to access just the activities of daily living. And because we do them so frequently, you know, we want to make sure that we are optimizing them for our own personal bodies. And keep in mind that that's going to look a little bit different for every person because every body is individual. And so there is no right or good way to move. There is just the movement that happens in your body, and how can we optimize that movement for your body. So I would encourage you to approach this as an hour of learning, an hour of exploration, and an hour of being able to kind of hone some tools for your own personal movement toolbox that you can use on a daily basis to make your body feel better in this world, doing things like picking your keys up off the ground, reaching for the thing from the high shelf, picking your child up off the ground, putting the car seat in the back seat, you know, whatever the things are that you do every day, that's kind of what we want to focus on. Like I said, you know, not an exhaustive list. I'm not here to tell you like what's right and what's wrong. I'm just here to encourage you to kind of explore what works for your body, what doesn't work for your body. And that being said, I would also encourage you to kind of like use this as a launching point to explore further, hear other people's opinions aside from mine. There's lots of them out there and nobody's right or wrong. There's just kind of like, you know, what works for you, what doesn't work for you. I have posted a link in the comments of this live stream that illustrates a concept that I kind of want to start with as the foundation of what we're going to talk about. It's called the joint by joint approach. And a man named Michael Boyle coined that idea. And it's talked about kind of across movement modalities. And the idea with the joint by joint approach is that the architecture of each of our joints either promotes mobility or stability. The architecture meaning like just the shape of our joint. So like trying to be as in frame here as I can. The architecture of our elbow joint is a hinge, which means it goes like this, and it does not go so much in a circle. However, the architecture of our shoulder joint promotes a greater range of motion, a more circular range of motion, right? So we would, in the joint by joint approach, we kind of talk about how joints go from mobile, wrist, mobile, circular, right? Stable, elbow. Usually we want to promote stability in the elbow. Mobile, usually we want to promote mobility in the shoulder, and so on. We go from the feet up to the top of the head. And these patterns tend to go mobile, stable, mobile, stable, mobile, stable, right? So you can kind of go up the body and be like, oh, if my ankle is supposed to be mobile, I think my knee is probably supposed to be stable, or is the most optimally functional when I have the greatest amount of stability in my knee, when I have the greatest amount of mobility in my hip. And so that's kind of how, that's like the foundation of what we're going to talk about today and how we're going to think about movement. Often those relationships get turned around and we're not mobile in the places that we could be more mobile in. We're not stable in the places that we could be more stable in. And right on top of that is kind of this foundation of the idea that the more proximal stability, meaning like proximal along our spine or kind of torso area, the more proximal stability we can promote, the more distally mobile we'll be. And distal just meaning like my wrist is distal to my chest or my spine, right? Distal means just away. Proximal means close, right? So the more proximal stability we have, the more distal mobility we have, and the more we can kind of optimize that joint by joint functionality down the line. So the first thing that we're going to start with today is breathing. And we're going to talk about breathing into kind of our like, I'm going to say bottom of your pectoral line all the way down to the bottom of your pelvis, right? So the thing that you can identify as the most bottom part of your pelvis, if our pelvis were like a bowl filled with water and that bowl is facing our head, right? The very, very bottom of that bowl, and then like the bottom of your pectoral line is where I want you to think about your breath as happening, right? So you are going to think about your breath as filling up that entire space, right? So just take a big deep breath in through your nose and out through your mouth. Same thing again. Breathe in through your nose and out through your mouth. Don't think about anything special, right? All of the stuff I've told you before, right? Just let yourself breathe. Let yourself kind of relax and be calm. Continue to breathe here, in through your nose and out through your mouth. You are stimulating your nervous system into calmness, right, with this breathing. This is important because our body needs to, well, really our brain needs to feel safe before it can really do movement the best that it can, right? So we're trying to make our brain feel safe enough to connect to our muscles and our joints in a way maybe that it doesn't normally every day when we're not deep breathing and kind of hacking our nervous system into that breath, right? This is why I start everything with breathing. Puts the brain in a state of calm, puts our nervous system in a state of calm, and allows us to receive new information into the motor system and really make it a little bit more permanent than superficial, right? So 2 minutes of breathing, if that, right? Breathing into this kind of, I call it like the lower 2/3 of your torso, right? So you can do this seated in a chair, on your legs, lying down on your back, in a comfortable position, whatever comfortable is for you, right? So breathing in through the nose, out through the mouth. I want you now to, we're gonna focus this breath. We're gonna optimize this breath as best we can to create this foundation for proximal stability or core engagement, right? Whatever core means to you, we're gonna kind of prime our core to be stable so that we can talk about, you know, how the rest of our body can kind of move as optimally as possible. So you're gonna take your hands here, point your finger and your thumb, and you're gonna put them around the sides of your rib cage like this. And now, instead of just breathing, I want you to inhale and try to expand your rib cage into your hands, right? Laterally, side to side. And then I want you to exhale, and I want you to press your hands into your rib cage and feel the rib cage move in the opposite direction, right? So it's like you're playing an accordion with your rib cage. You're gonna inhale, expand the rib cage laterally, open the accordion, and exhale, close the rib cage in the opposite direction, contracting the accordion, right? And I really like that image because as you open the accordion and you inhale, you're seeing the air come into the central space of that accordion, right? And then you're pushing into the accordion to push the air out and to make the sound, right? This is kind of how our core works when we breathe and how we can prime our core to do movement, right? So you can keep your hands on your rib cage if that works for you. You can bring your arms down by your sides. You can close your eyes, right? Explore. Try one of each. Put one hand here. Put another hand over here, right? You're gonna inhale through your nose, expand as laterally as you can. And then exhale, contract as laterally as you can. Same thing, a couple more times here. Breathing in through your nose. And out through your mouth. Out through your mouth like you're fogging up a mirror right in front of your face. Once more, breathe in through your nose. And out through your mouth. We're gonna do a couple more deep breaths, focusing not just on expanding the rib cage laterally, but also breathing all the way down into the very bottom of that bowl of your pelvis, right? So it's expanding now really three-dimensionally, like a balloon expands when you inhale or when you blow it up, right? So try that with that image a couple times. Inhaling, breathing as three-dimensionally as you can. And exhale, contract equally as three-dimensionally as you can. Good. Couple more times here. Inhale. And exhale. Once more. Inhale. And exhale. Beautiful. You can continue to do that. It's a great way to, like I said before, just kind of like prime your nervous system to receive new information. And it's an excellent way to prime your core to stabilize your spine, really, because that's what we're talking about, right? Stabilizing the spine through the core. That is kind of the job of the core. And all of our movement comes out of this idea of breath, and breath being the foundation or the key that kind of opens the door for you to be able to access your core, right? And your core is a system of muscles that includes your belly, it includes your back, It includes your pelvic floor. It includes your diaphragm, your main breathing muscle. So all of these things have to kind of work together as a system to really optimize movement. Whatever you're doing, whatever modality you prefer, breath is always a fantastic way to start. Okay, so I'm gonna tell you the 7 movements that we're gonna kind of talk about, and I'm gonna give you, and I have my notes here with me because I don't want to forget anything. So if you see me look down at my notes, that's what I'm doing. We are going to cover a hip hinge, and I will go much more into detail about each of these movements. A squat, a lunge, pushing, pulling, rotation, and ambulation. And like I said in the beginning, these things are going to look different for everybody, depending on how you move throughout the world, right? So a squat for a seated mover is going to look a lot different than a squat for a bipedal mover. And so I'm going to do my best to kind of give everybody options, but I would also encourage you very much to explore. If something's not working for you, try to think like, okay, how can I make this work for me? What type of movement can I do? Like I said, I'm going to try to kind of give you a direction to go in so you're not just kind of going blindly into something. So let's get into the hip hinge, right? So the architecture, going off that joint by joint approach, the architecture of our hip joints kind of dictates mobility, right? And so that means that we want to move from the hips, or where our thigh bone enters our hip socket, more than we want to move from the spine, right? And you can see how you can accomplish the same task by either moving from the hip or from the spine. I'm going to stay seated here because, you know, the frame of me will stay with my head and my spine in it if I'm seated here, right? So if I am going to go pick up this thing off the ground, I can do it from my spine. I can bend my spine and go pick the thing up, which is fine because this is how we move through the world, and you know, it's okay to move from your spine. Or I can pick the thing up by keeping my spine stable and hinging or moving at my hips here to go pick the thing up, right? So we're not gonna do that every time we need to go pick something up, but I think it's really important to understand what you're doing so that you can make a choice about how you pick the thing up off the ground, how you pick your child up off the ground. Because when we do something over and over and over again, maybe our body's not super into it, right? And maybe we need to find a different way to do it. So it's really all about self-efficacy, I think, movement, and making choices that are the best for you. Doing the thing on purpose rather than just doing the thing not on purpose without knowing. So this is about like freedom of movement and freedom to move through the world as comfortably as possible. So a couple of things that we want to talk about with the hip hinge is one, it requires mobility of the hips. When we sit for long periods of time, sometimes we lose that mobility. And so I want to give you a good way to increase your hip mobility so that you can really feel the separation of your thigh bone from the hip socket, because that's really what we're talking about with hip mobility. So if you're a seated mover, I will say the best way to increase mobility of your hips, right, is to get out of your chair, right, to transfer out of your chair and onto the floor and just open up the space in the front of your body, right? Lying down on your stomach if that's available, lying down on your back if that's available. If you are a bipedal mover, one of my favorite ways to increase hip mobility is to come down onto the floor into what I call a Z-sit or a 90-90 sit. If like knee pain is an issue for you, and the thought of getting on the floor in this position, like you look at it and you're just like, nope, not for me, right? What I would do is put something underneath your seat. So I'm just gonna grab my box here and show you what that could look like, either on something as small as a yoga block or something as big as like an actual chair, right? So my head's gonna come out of the frame here, but that's just the way it is, right? So here we are. You're gonna just kind of drape one foot forward and then put the other leg back. And you can kind of see here that I'm giving my hip this really nice open position, and I'm turning the thigh bone inward towards my midline, which we call internal rotation. This leg is doing the opposite, right? This leg is folded in front, it's bent at the hip, and it's turned away from my midline. This is called external rotation, right? So you're letting your thigh bones rotate in each direction, and you're also letting them extend. This back leg is extended at the hip and flex in each direction, right? So we're encouraging kind of all of the planes of movement that happen in the hips and that we need to just kind of like have a healthy hip joint. And so from this position, I'm gonna go back to the floor and show it there, but same kind of cues and direction as I do this, right? If you are seated, a seated mover, and you've transferred to the floor, what you can do is lie down on your back if that's available to you, and you can use your hands to manually push your legs together or just straighten them out and just lay and rotate thigh bones inward, rotate thigh bones outward, right? And you're using your hands to manually do that. Otherwise, hip mobility and rotation, you're gonna take your left hip and you're gonna try to push your left hip forward and up, right? So I'm rotating through my thigh bone here, and then pull my left hip back and down. And it's okay if both of your butts are not on the ground, totally fine, right? Mine are not, and that's okay. We're not looking for perfection by any means, right? So if you're thinking, oh, like, or even symmetry from side to side, right? We're not necessarily looking for that. I would just encourage you to notice what your body does, where it is, how it moves, and not really attach any judgment to that, right? So as you start to move through your hip, you might notice that you have a little bit more mobility after a few repetitions, right? Maybe your sit bone, the very, very bottom of your pelvis, the bones that you can sit on and feel, maybe you can feel that getting a little bit closer to the ground every time you try to push it back down to the ground, right? And that's really the goal, is just kind of like a change from the start to the end. And so, moving hip forward, moving hip back. I like to put my hands on my knees. It's a really great place to have them. You can put your hands on your chest. You can open your arms out to the side. Whatever makes you feel good about this movement, right? And then you're just gonna switch. You're gonna do the other side. Put the other leg in front. Same thing. You're gonna push the right hip up and forward and down and back. You may have gotten into this position on the other side, and it might be a completely different experience, right? Almost like two different bodies. And humans are asymmetrical, right? So you're gonna notice these differences from side to side. It's a very, very normal and natural thing to feel. I I don't know that I've met a human yet who does not feel differences side to side, right? So this is something to embrace, not to feel like it's a deficiency, but to be like, oh, good. I know I'm human because I feel different from right to left. Yeah. And so all of the things that I'm going to show you today are things that you can do throughout the day as many times as they feel good for your body, right? There's no like overdoing this kind of stuff, right? So we're just encouraging the movement of the thigh bone in the hip socket. Like a brush cleans out a bottle, right? That's what I always imagine when I do this. I encourage you to come up with your own images that kind of speak to you though, because those are often the most powerful. So whatever this rotational movement reminds you of, attach that image to this movement, and your brain and your body, your brain and your muscles and your joints are going to connect to each other a little bit better. All right. So improving a little bit of hip mobility. Maybe you feel like you're a little bit more down to the floor with the right sit bone than you were before, than you were when you started. And so if you can, get on your hands and your knees. You are going to get on your hands and your knees. If that is not an option for you, and you're down on the floor, you're going to take one leg into your hand and pull the knee towards the chest. You can do that with both knees, right? Manually pull your legs up, hold your legs like this, right? And then we're going to kind of talk about the same things. What I want to focus on is the movement of our sits bones, right? Our sits bones, very bottom of our pelvis, the bones that we sit on, right? So if I sit back to my heels, my sits bones are directly in line with my heels. So if I'm on my hands and my knees here, my sits bones are pointing directly behind me, right? If you're on your back, your sits bones are pointing straight down the end of your mat. What we want to think about is your spine being nice and long and kind of, we call it neutral, right? It's neutral is just not rounded and not extended. So you're somewhere in the middle, right? You're not squeezing your butt and pulling it under, right? You're relaxing your butt and you're letting your butt stretch. You're letting your sits bones be really wide. And you're thinking about maybe 2 car headlights that point in the same direction. Sits bones are just like that. 2 car headlights pointing directly behind you. Now from this position, you're going to shift your hips back towards your heels without letting your sits bones point down towards your heels, right? So you're going to move the hips back towards the heels for as long as you can until you feel like you can't move back anymore without rounding your spine, right, or losing tension in your spine. You're going to shift your hips back as far as you can. So you're increasing this angle here. This is a hip hinge. And then you're going to rock yourself forward. Same thing again. You're going to hinge back. Feel your sits bones open wide, like car headlights getting wider apart from each other, and then hinge forward. If you're on the ground and you're pulling your knees towards your chest, it's the same idea. Think about pushing your tailbone down to the floor and creating a little space underneath your low back, right? So that you're really pointing your sits bones straight down your mat. Excellent. This is a good foundation for a hip hinge. Shift back and shift forward. Now we can continue to do this with knees coming towards each other, right? So we're internally rotating the thigh bones, and we can think about the same thing. Or we can go knees apart, feet together, and do the same thing, externally rotating the thigh bones, right? We're gonna kind of skip over those today just so that we can keep moving, but I would encourage you to give both of those positions a try because it feels really, really good. And then we can take the hip hinge and bring it more upright. So we think about a hip hinge as maybe frequently occurring in daily life as picking something up off the ground. So I'm gonna stand up here and definitely like half my body's gonna be cut off, but my pelvis is still gonna be in frame, which is really the important part of this, right? So a hip hinge is gonna be, I'm gonna actually just move this, sorry. There we go, okay. So a hip hinge from the side, same idea that we just worked with, right? And if you're a seated mover, sitting in your chair is going to be the same thing, right? So working from the hip socket, you're going to hinge forward. You feel or see how your sits bones start to point back. Your buns relax, your chest drops forward as your tail lifts up, right? My knees are bending a little bit because that feels good to me. It makes me feel more stable. If I were to straighten my legs, I would have much less ability to fold at my hips because my hamstrings are a little bit tight, right? So if that's also you, soften your knees and then come back up, right? And if you're a seated mover, you're doing the same thing. You're folding at your hips. You're letting your chest lean forward, keeping tension through your spine, right? So as soon as we bring a movement from the floor onto the feet or into a more upright position, not necessarily onto the feet, but as soon as we bring the movement from the floor to a loaded spine, it just becomes a little bit more complicated, right? Because now we're asking our core to work as that system to stabilize our spine. So as you hinge forward, I would like you to purposefully exhale. So we're gonna pause, take a deep inhale, and exhale, hinge forward. Inhale, come back up. And exhale, hinge forward. Right? So here we're asking our core to kind of inhale, expand, and exhale, contract like we practiced in the beginning. And that you're using that core to keep your spine stable. And this is kind of how we want to think about most of these 7 functional movements as having a stable spine and then building off that, right? So core is going to be a part of every single one of these functional or foundational exercises. Exhale, hinge forward. Sits bones reach wide as you hinge forward. Sits bones narrow as you stand. 2 more times here. Sits bones open wide. 2 car headlights pointing directly behind you. Sits bones narrow. Those car headlights are now pointing down at your feet. 1 more time. Hinge forward. And back up. Excellent, you did it. A hip hinge, right? So the hip hinge kind of happens in several other foundational movements like the squat and the lunge, which we're gonna move on to now. Right, so the squat and the lunge build off of the hip hinge, and they now incorporate other joints like your ankle and your knee, right? Especially if you are a bipedal mover. If you're a seated mover, the mobility of your ankles and your feet and your toes is still super crucial, and there's a lot of stuff that we can do there. So I am going to show you a couple ways that I like to start to mobilize the foot and the ankle. We do not have to use this today, but I have this little spiky ball that I like to use to kind of stimulate the bottom of the foot, to start to get the brain to connect all the way down to the foot, because that literally is a long way to go for the brain. We can do this many, many different ways. This is one of my favorite ways to do this. You take the ball and you roll it on the bottom of your foot. Doesn't have to be a spiky ball. It can be a tennis ball. It can be a golf ball. It can be, a sensory mat. It can be like a bunch of pebbles on the ground, right? Anything to get your brain to recognize all of those little specialized nerves on the bottom of your foot is a very powerful thing. Just like breathing primes our core to do work, this primes our brain to connect to the foot. Right, so we're not going to necessarily roll out today, but I would encourage you to find a surface or a ball in your home that you can just start to like roll your foot on, because it's super awesome and feels really good. So in lieu of that, what we're going to do today is just manually mobilize our toes and our foot. So here I am. I'm going to move this back down because I'm going to sit back down. I know my room is not very big. And so this is like as far away as I can get. What I would like you to do is access your foot, your right foot, however that is possible for you. If it is not possible to access your foot, if you can, find a wall that you can go put your foot on. That will also work, right? Because we're just going to try to mobilize the toes and the arch of the foot a little bit. So you're going to take your big toe and just move it around, right? You're either passively moving it around with your hand, or you're passively moving it around with your hand. That's all we're doing right now, right? So just like move your big toe around. This joint, it tends to get kind of crunchy. I mean, we lock our feet up in shoes all day long, and that's not really the best place for them usually. So we want to really give our toes and our foot as much out of shoe time as possible. Go down to the other toes and move them around, right? If your foot is on a wall, or if you are a seated mover and you're in bare feet, can you move your foot around the bottom of your chair? Can you get some movement through the toes in any way that is available to you? We are then going to walk up to the arch of our foot and take the forefoot into one hand and the heel into the other hand. And I want you to twist your foot like you're wringing out a washcloth, right? So you twist in one direction, you twist in the other direction. Now we're just getting the foot to move in kind of this spiral-like way that is really important for walking, and also just important to get blood flow, like down into the lower limbs and the foot. Right? Movement of the foot and the bones in the foot are a really, really good thing to do on a daily basis. And then you're going to walk up to the heel, and you're going to see if you can move your heel around. Like, does it clunk? We don't think about our heel as being a joint that has movement. Doesn't have a lot of movement, but it should have a little bit. You should or could feel a little like clunk, 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 right? A little bit of movement, and that heel will go a long way. You're going to do this on both feet. Take the big toe, move it around. Take the other toes, move them around. I'm going to kind of blaze through this a little bit faster, right? So the hip hinge, we spent a lot of time there because it is an important foundation for the next two movements. We're going to go a little faster through these movements because we've kind of gone over the hip hinge. Now we're going to try to just warm up the ankles, right? the other mobile joint in that lower leg complex, right? So the hips and the ankles, we want them to be as mobile as they can be, right? Definitely not a rule, because sometimes we humans are on the like too mobile side and we need to walk it back a little bit, right? So there is situations where your hips and your ankles might be more mobile than they need to be, but that's, you know, then we get into kind of like details. In the general population, ankles and hips tend to be a lot less mobile than we would like them to be. So from after we've mobilized the actual foot and the ankle, you're going to come into a half kneel. And if you are a seated mover and you've found a wall, can you take your leg and bring it up onto the wall as high as you can with your foot flat on the wall, right? This might be something that you're like, that's not going to happen for me. Totally fine. And you can kind of stay where you are doing what you're doing, and the next couple things will definitely be a little bit more accessible for you. So if you are here with me in your half kneel position, what you're going to do is lean forward over your toes, and then lean back, hip hinge, sticking your butt back. You're not going to straighten your front leg, but it's going to get straighter. And then forward and back. So this is the general movement. What we're going to do now is encourage weight to go into the ball of the big toe as you lean forward. The knee stays over the toes, as in not inside, not outside, but over. And then you're going to encourage weight to go towards the pinky toe as you shift the hips back. And then weight towards the big toe as you shift the hips forward. You're going to take your hands. This gets really fun. And just come with me and explore, right? You're going to take your hands onto your lower leg. You are going to twist the bones of the lower leg away from your midline as you shift the hips back and bring weight into the pinky toe. I know this is a lot, but you can watch this video as many times as you want. And then you're going to go weight forward into the big toe, and you're going to manually encourage the lower leg bones to roll inward. Same thing again, pinky toe, shift back, roll out. Big toe, shift forward, roll in. What we're encouraging is arch of the foot to lift as you roll out. And you can kind of see that happening, right? My big toe does not need to leave the ground, but my arch all of a sudden engages. And then big toe finds more weight. Ankle bone shifts inward. And my arch deforms or flattens towards the floor, right? So this is what we're encouraging here, right? This is gonna prep our ankles to find a little bit more mobility for a squat. And so what I want you to do from here is do both sides, right? We're gonna kind of dive right into this one so that we can do both sides and then find a little bit of a squat. You're gonna shift forward, roll the lower leg bones inward, feel the arch deform or flatten or pronate towards the floor. And then shift lower leg bones away towards the pinky toe, arch pulls away from the floor or foot supinates. One more time, same thing. I promise we'll get through all 7 movements. And then back. Right? Okay, so how does this translate into something like a squat? How many times do you find yourself doing something, picking something up off the ground, needing to get close to the ground, right? That's a squat. And so what I would encourage you to do is, if this position all the way down here is accessible for you, amazing. Be there as much as you can be there, right? Sits bones are wide, spine is tall and straight. Putting your elbows between your knees and pushing out is a fabulous stretch. If you look at this and you're like, oh no, that is not where I can be, right? Find a countertop or a wall and use it to help you get down as far as you can, right? You're just trying to find some mobility, whatever that means for you, some depth, right? Maybe it's a chair, like a high chair, and you're just sitting down to that chair as low as you can and then standing back up. Or you're holding onto a high countertop and you're going down and standing back up, right? But getting and being in that position with knees open, ankles flexed, knees bent, right? That is an important position to practice being in, because we're there whether we like it many, many times during the day, regardless of kind of whether we think we can squat or not, right? And so if you're a seated mover and you want to encourage that above the hip knee flexion, right? You're seated, you're gonna manually take your leg into your hand and you're gonna lift it up, pulling your knee towards your chest, right? What's the difference between this and the hip hinge movement that we did lying on the ground? Right here, lying down, spine is unloaded. So it's a little bit less demanding, right? Here, you've loaded your spine, and so it is a little bit more demanding. You're asking your core to do a lot more work as you pull that leg towards you. And that's a really, really good starting place for a squat, right? So all of those things happen before we can actually squat down with no assistance, right? Try using a countertop, using something to help you balance, and then slowly take the support away and see how low you can go, right? Take the support away, squat down to a high chair, make that chair lower over time until you can finally get down and maybe really get the hips to open, the knees to bend, and the ankles to flex, right? Remember, we're not looking for perfection. We're just looking for a little bit of improvement from where you started to then, you know, where you not ended, but in that journey, you're just looking for improvement, right? So we can think about a lunge as the unilateral version of a squat. A lunge tends to be, well, I think is one of the most beneficial positions to be in personally, right? We're getting this fantastic unilateral stimulus, which again, if we go back to the very first thing that we started with, the hip mobility, right? We are learning things about each side of our body when we do movements single-sided, so unilaterally, right? So you can really feel the difference between one side and the other side when you take kind of the complication of a two-sided movement away. So this helps us with motor control and can help us connect to our brain and our body a little bit more. It still requires ankle mobility, knee stability, hip mobility, right? So we're just kind of building off of that idea of a squat and taking it into something that is a little bit more brain focused. I don't know if that's the word that I want to use, because all movement is brain focused, right? But this just requires a little bit more lateral stability, right? So if I'm balancing here, it's really like standing on one leg, right? If this stance leg is my one leg, it's really like standing on one leg, but I've just taken it down a notch and made it a little bit more accessible for my own body. Because standing on one leg is hard, right? And we will get there. That is part of ambulation if bipedal ambulation is something that you do. So you're gonna think about, in your half kneel, the outside of your stance leg, in this case it's my left leg, being flat, right? I wanna try to not kind of kickstand my leg. I wanna take my hip, boop, and pull it up and in, right? So this requires a fair amount of lateral stability from this whole side part, side seam of my body, right? Remember when we started with this, lateral expansion of the rib cage, right? That lateral expansion of the rib cage helps you prime your system to find lateral support all the way down into the hip. If you are a bipedal mover, if you walk around, you spend about 60% of your walking time on one leg. So it is really important that we're, kind of good at being on one leg at a time. So this is a really, really good way to start. I try to spend the majority of my teaching time in a half kneel, right? So just being here is fairly demanding, right? I can turn this up a notch by being here and then trying to lift my front foot for a half a second, right? I'm gonna try to lift my front foot without moving the rest of my body, right? So go ahead and give that a try. Move your front foot without moving the rest of your body. It might be so hard, right? You wanna grab something that helps you stabilize so that you can start to feel that, right? Balance, you don't wanna be distracted by the balance or feeling like you're gonna fall over, that you can't do it. Make it work for you, grab something. And then try to lift, right? I'm trying really hard, even with my support here, to not shift side to side, forward or back, right? It's tough. It is very demanding on the front of my leg too. It feels like work, it feels like a stretch. Let's try it on the other side. I'm thinking about vertical limbs here as well, right? So my front shin is vertical. My stance thigh is also vertical. My toes are tucked under. And I'm gonna try the same thing here, right? And you, like we said in the beginning, two sides, totally different, right? You might get into this position and be like, oh, I got this. I can totally lift my front leg. Or it might be the opposite, right? I definitely need some support here. I'm gonna exhale, stabilize my core, and I'm gonna lift. And that takes a tremendous amount of concentration and work. But it's a fun exploration, right? So if you don't spend any time in a half kneel, start spending some time in half kneel. It's really fantastic, right? So this half kneel position then gets to turn into a lunge where we take it from the floor and we stand all the way up, right? And this is a really nice way, especially when we're working with asymmetries in the body, right? Say like you stand on one leg really well and you stand on the other leg not as well. Rather than squatting and reinforcing those asymmetries, just kind of letting them be there, we can lunge instead. And we have a much better chance of kind of addressing those asymmetries in the body than we do with a squat. So a lunge is a really, really nice way to kind of regress a squat. So one leg in front, one leg behind, spine long and straight, core engaged, right? And lunge. So, oh my goodness. We're like almost done here. I'm gonna, what I'm gonna do is I am going to, because with the Facebook Live, we're scheduled to end in like 5 minutes, and I'm apparently really poor at time management. because I've gotten through half of the exercises. But I am going to continue recording, and I am going to post the Zoom recorded link to my personal Facebook page, Olivia Rising Facebook page, and my Instagram account, so that there we can go through all of the movement. And I will try to just be pretty brief here. I feel like we covered some really important ones. Push, pull, rotation, and ambulation. So pushing and pulling, we do them all day, all the time, right? So the thing that we want to think about are stable shoulder blades and mobile shoulder blades. Our shoulder blades on our rib cage are stable, meaning they stay on the back of the rib cage as long as our arms are in front of our body and shoulder height. The shoulder blades need to become mobile and move away from the spine as soon as we go overhead. And then they need to come towards the spine as soon as we go behind our body, right? Those are kind of the basic rules of how our shoulder blades should move. So we do want to encourage mobility of the shoulder blades to find kind of harmonization of the shoulder girdle for arm movement. So one of my favorite things to do for pushing movements and to just start to play with mobility of the shoulder blades is find a wall. You're going to put your hands on the wall. I'm going to turn my back to you so that you can kind of see what I'm doing. You're going to put your hands on the wall, and you're going to push into the wall and push your shoulder blades apart from each other so that your spine rounds a little bit, and then just pull the shoulder blades onto your back. Push into the wall so that your spine rounds and your rib cage goes back, and then pull your shoulder blades towards. You could also do this on the floor, right? Where you're pushing into the floor, push. And my shoulder blades go from my back, kind of down the side of my body, right? That's what I'm imagining. And then shoulder blades come onto the back. Push into the floor, push the shoulder blades away, and pull the shoulder blades towards. This is encouraging or exploring how the shoulder blades move in that direction. We also have shoulder blades moving up and down as well as apart, right? So as soon as our arms come overhead, the shoulder blade needs to move away from the spine and around to the side seam of the rib cage, like curtains on a stage. The way that I like to think about this as I raise my arm is I begin to lift my arm, and I'm encouraging my armpit to show forward, and not just forward, but up, right? So I'm trying to turn my armpit up and forward. This happens every time we lift our arms, right? If we don't allow the shoulder blade to move, or if we can't get the shoulder blade to move, we might do that instead. Or we might do this, right? Which is spinal movement instead of shoulder blade movement. So these are things to consider as we get into overhead pulling, overhead pushing. Both important, right? So here we are, we're pushing, hands on the floor, push shoulder blades apart, pull shoulder blades together, push apart, and pull together. For pulling movements, shoulder blades, same rules, right? Pulling, we're gonna pull towards our body. However, as soon as my elbows pass behind me, I'm gonna think about squeezing my shoulder blades together, right? And I wanna squeeze my shoulder blades together as I pull the elbows behind me, more than I want to push my rib cage forward, right? Because that's, again, spinal movement rather than shoulder blade movement. And you can see me talk about the spine and arm movement because this is a thing that tends to happen when we start to move our arms, and we're, you know, not fully optimizing the mobility of the shoulders as we start to accommodate that by getting mobility through the spine. And primarily kind of the low back, right? We want our low back to remain as stable as possible. And we actually want the mobility in our spine to come from the part of our spine where our ribs attach, or our thoracic spine, right? So as I reach my arm overhead, it requires a fair amount of mobility through my thoracic spine. That means if I spend a lot of time like this, I try to lift my arm up, my arm is only going to get so high before I get stopped, because my spine is actually not letting my arm get higher, right? So I want to show you one thing before we part ways. And it's 11:31. This is called book opening. Stay with me for just one more minute. You're going to either lie down on the floor, you're going to sit in your chair. You're going to bring one arm in front of you. You're going to lift that arm up, and you're going to rotate through your spine. Look towards your hand, right? Thoracic mobility. And if you're seated in your chair, this is called book opening. If you're seated in your chair, same exact thing. You're going to rotate to one side and then open and rotate to the other side, right? So this spinal rotation, super important, especially for seated movers who use pushing as ambulation all the time, all day, right? So you'll do that on both sides. Find rotation, find rotation. You could also take one arm, reach it up and over to the other arm, and find rotation there, right? So we are going to part ways here. I'm going to try to post on my Instagram page a little bit about ambulation, but ambulation is really this kind of like a, you know, a little bit of a separate thing from the other functional movements, foundational movements that we just talked about. This will live on the Livity Rising Facebook page, this recording, forever, I think, as long as it's up. And then it'll also live on my personal page and on my Instagram account as well. I would encourage you to continue to explore these movements. Message me with any questions, anything that I was not clear on that you want more clarification about. And it was a pleasure working and learning and hanging out with you all for the last hour. I hope that that gave you a few things to do kind of in your everyday to just optimize your movement as you move throughout life. Thank you very much. And hopefully I'll see you all again sometime soon. Okay, thank you.